Hello, everybody. It is 12:10. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative. We are the tech cluster. So I'm so excited to welcome Becca Lewis to BESI today. This will be our final tech talk of the year, and what an important talk to hear today in these times. Becca has been on my radar screen since I read the reports she wrote for Data and Society back in the late 2010s. They were at the time the most advanced research you could find on far-right online broadcasting, on media manipulation, on disinformation. Years later, she has added historical depth to her analysis of the far right. She now comes to us holding a fresh PhD in communication theory and research from Stanford and finishing a postdoc at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, also at Stanford. And last but not least, she's an incoming assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Media Studies at MIT. Congratulations. So we wanted to grab her. Yes. It's great to get a job in these times. So we wanted to grab her for a talk before she moved east, because I don't think you've ever spoken at Berkeley. So Becca's work has been published in academic journals, including New Media and Society, Social Media and Society, and American Behavioral Scientist, and in news outlets. In 2022, she served as an expert witness in the defamation lawsuit brought against Alex Jones by the parents of a Sandy Hook shooting victim. The research we will hear about today is from Becca's book manuscript, which is an archival-based historical study of how a reactionary futurist network of conservative activists used the emerging technology of the internet to undermine the authority of mass media and public education. So her work really is essential because it complicates conventional histories of the tech industry that tend to be centered around left-wing anarcho-libertarian networks, and it offers, therefore, many novel insights into the processes of building this reactionary network, but also in the processes of online radicalization and polarization. So join me in welcoming Becca, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Marion, and thank you to the BESI Tech Cluster and to all of you for being here today. I am going to speak about tech's right turn, how reactionary politics came to Silicon Valley. And I'm going to talk basically in three parts. First, I want to talk about this idea of the right turn in Silicon Valley and how and when it actually came to happen. Then I'm going to delve in, and for the bulk of the talk, look at the creation of what I call this set of ideas, reactionary futurism. And then we'll look at how these sets of ideas spread in Silicon Valley and beyond in the 1990s. So, to start, I want to show you a headline from this past summer from Business Insider claiming that Silicon Valley's loudest investors are suddenly all in on Donald Trump. Some may recognize the man in the photo here. This is Marc Andreessen, one of the most noteworthy, wealthy venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Some people may have seen this headline. Some people may have seen one similar to it. In fact, there was a whole slew of headlines throughout this summer and fall seeming to identify a right turn in Silicon Valley. And in addition to Marc Andreessen, these articles pointed to J.D. Vance, now the vice president, who comes from the world of Silicon Valley or tech investing. And of course, much of the news has focused on Elon Musk and the rightward lurch of X under his leadership. And of course, now we know he has been bringing that rightward lurch to the federal government. So unsurprisingly, I'm sure we have all encountered it. We are seeing this language everywhere, that tech has taken a right turn, Silicon Valley has taken a right turn. But in fact, this is not the first time that people have identified a right turn happening in Silicon Valley. So we can look back to 2016, for example, when there was a earlier slew of articles that seemed to identify a right turn. So we can see here the Washington Post that year identified a radicalization trend in Silicon Valley. We can see New York Times op-ed saying that Silicon Valley took a right turn. It's a little bit tough to remember, but this same sort of language was already there in 2016. In fact, that also wasn't the first time that critics and journalists identified a right turn in Silicon Valley. We can actually go all the way back to 1998, when the tech journalist Michael Malone wrote an article in an industry publication telling readers to forget digital utopia because we could be headed for techno-fascism. And he claimed that alongside the usual liberals and libertarians in the Valley, there was also a group of what he called techno-reactionaries on the right, and that people should pay attention to this because it could have implications for the world of tech and beyond. So this discovery and rediscovery of the right turn in Silicon Valley has led me to ask, when and how did Silicon Valley actually turn to the right? And why do we keep forgetting the fact that there is this right-wing presence in the Valley? Those who are familiar with histories of Silicon Valley may be familiar with the dominant narrative around politics and ideology here, which points to this term, the Californian ideology, which was identified 30 years ago at this point by the Marxist scholars Barbrook and Cameron. And really, they identified that Silicon Valley, the Californian ideology, was this mixture of countercultural aesthetics and kind of a hipness combined with economic libertarianism. And the important thing to note for us is that Barbrook and Cameron claimed there were no obvious rivals to the Californian ideology. They said the triumph of it appears to be complete. Now, I am not denying in my research or here today that the Californian ideology was incredibly important and has had major influence on the world of Silicon Valley. It absolutely has, and amazing scholarship has shown that much. But I am challenging the fact that it had no obvious rivals and that its triumph was complete. Because in the course of my research, what I found is that there was another ideology present in Silicon Valley in the 1990s. And I've come to call that ideology reactionary futurism. And we can think of reactionary futurism as its own combination of unlikely forces. So it's an embrace of free market capitalism, as with the Californian ideology. It's a techno-enthusiasm, a real excitement, and almost quasi-spiritual zeal for new information technologies. But it also synthesized these ideas with a deep social conservatism. And what I'm going to take you through today is how these ideas were formed, and also how in the 1980s and 90s, they came to Silicon Valley and gained influence and legitimacy over the course, at the end of the 20th century. So with that in mind, let's dive into this history of how reactionary futurism formed. To understand the formation of this set of ideas, we have to turn to a man named George Gilder. And we can see George Gilder here on the cover of Wired magazine in 1996. Wired at the time was the hip source for digital culture. And George Gilder at the time was one of the most vocal and well-known evangelists of Silicon Valley. His name has largely been forgotten now, but if you look at articles or materials about Silicon Valley at that time, he crops up everywhere. He was one of the people making sure Silicon Valley got on the cultural and economic map. He also was a high-tech prophet who would talk about where the future was headed and what technologies would and wouldn't succeed. And as part of this project, he became arguably the most influential and successful investment guru in the Valley. He ran an investment newsletter called the Gilder Technology Report that was so successful, it caused something called the Gilder effect, which was he would mention a technology in his newsletters, his subscribers would rush to invest in it, and the stock price would go up. So he literally had an impact on the economy of Silicon Valley. He also was a longtime social conservative. He got his start in the 1970s as a mentee of William F. Buckley Jr., the well-known kind of godfather of modern American conservatism. He published anti-feminist tracts throughout the 1970s, and in fact, he would speak proudly for decades about the fact that the National Organization for Women, NOW, had named him Male Chauvinist Pig of the Year in 1974. By the 1980s, he had remade himself into an economic guru and one of the primary proponents of supply-side economics. His book that he published in this decade, Wealth and Poverty, became known as the Bible of Reagan's first administration, and people could see it on every desk of the Office of Management and Budget. By the time he remade himself in the 1990s as a tech guru, a lot of the coverage didn't quite know what to do with him. Wired magazine was not known for being socially conservative, and they would talk highly of him and his ideas about technology, and they would kind of suggest that he had maybe dropped some of his ideas about feminism and that, now he was progressive because he had embraced high technology in a feature where the Wired writer looked through his older books. They pointed to one of his anti-feminist tracts and said, "This one's only for the diehard Gilder fans." But what I want to suggest is that far from kind of leaving behind these earlier ideas, actually Gilder had synthesized his anti-feminism, his free market economics, and his techno-enthusiasm into a coherent ideology. And so I'm going to take you through how these ideas all kind of merged with each other, starting with the 1970s and the specifics behind his anti-feminist ideas. So, when Gilder wrote in the 1970s, this was a moment when feminism and women's liberation had started to emerge. It was a moment when traditional gender roles were being challenged, and it was a moment when there started to be socially conservative backlash against these changes. And Gilder became one of the leading voices of that backlash. He wrote in his 1973 book, Sexual Suicide, about the need for the nuclear family to be at a primary part of society. This was the core institution that he focused on. And when he talked about nuclear family, he meant a very traditional picture of a heterosexual married couple with children and with a male breadwinner and a female homemaker. And he said that this was the most important structure because the way of bringing about the future was by procreating. And so society should be structured around procreation, that the only way to bring humanity into the future was by having more babies, and that the nuclear family was the best environment in which to do so. And he also stressed differences between the sexes, which he argued were at the foundation of modern society, and that they were both biological and social. And what he said was that women's sexuality unfolded over a longer timescale, that women were naturally more oriented to the future than men were because their sexuality involved things like childbirth, menstruation, breastfeeding, and so on. Men, on the other hand, didn't have a natural orientation to the future because their sexuality took place on the shorter time span of purely the sexual act. And so, from his perspective, men needed to have control over the domain of work and the economic world because that was the way that men became oriented to the future. And work trained them to become fathers and vice versa. So he developed this connection between fatherhood and economic power within the nuclear family. But of course, he saw this as deeply under threat, as with many other social conservatives at the time. And one of the biggest threats he identified was the rise of feminist and women's liberation movements. As with others, he also identified federal welfare as a series of threats because increasingly throughout Johnson's Great Society programs, welfare programs were helping to support single mothers. And therefore, in his language, welfare programs turned men into cuckolds of the state, was how he phrased it. And he particularly developed a racialized understanding of welfare programs because welfare programs were now being used to help Black families. And he blamed Black poverty on welfare programs rather than on structural racism because he said that welfare programs were destroying Black families in America. In all of this, he was pretty much in line with other conservative thinkers of the time, but where he was unique was that he also pointed the finger at technological changes. So before he was a techno enthusiast, he was really scared of technology. And in particular, the technology that loomed largest over his work at this time was oral contraception, which had only become widely available in the decade before he was writing, right? It was only in the 1960s that the pill, the birth control pill, became really widespread. And he said that the birth control pill was a disastrous technology because it upset the rhythm of women's natural biological timescales and therefore overthrew the structure of the nuclear family. He also, a little bit more counterintuitively, was against things like in vitro fertilization, which I say counterintuitive because that one was actually, helping childbirth. But from his perspective, that threatened to take childbirth out of the domain of the nuclear family and put it into the domain of the state. And so all of these kind of biotechnologies that were getting developed at the time, he saw as a very, very serious threat to the male breadwinner role. So this was the kind of pessimism and almost nihilism that defined his work in the 1970s. And then he seemingly remade himself entirely for the 80s. He became an optimist. He himself got married. He started going to church. And, a lot of the coverage at the time when he released his next book in 1981, Wealth and Poverty, suggested that he was a new man, he had a positive outlook, and he was ready to be taken seriously as an economic thinker. But in fact, what I want to suggest is that he didn't actually leave behind any of his gender ideas. He looped them into a more optimistic vision of society in which masculinity could be redeemed. So Wealth and Poverty in 1981 made a moral case for capitalism. So he was publishing alongside other supply-side thinkers at the time who were justifying, tax breaks on the rich. This was trickle-down economics. But he was unique in making a moral case for capitalism. People sometimes called it a theology of capitalism. And he claimed that it was the most moral economic system because this supply side, the investors and the entrepreneurs, had to come up with something that they were giving to society before there was any promise of return. And so capitalism started with giving, he said. And as a result, entrepreneurship was an inherently moral endeavor. Entrepreneurs had to be creative, they had to be thinking of the future, they had to be orienting society towards beneficial goals that will help people out. And he argued that unlike federal welfare programs, wealth creation came from entrepreneurship. So if the people on welfare would simply become entrepreneurs, then they could actually help generate wealth for society. And just as importantly, entrepreneurship was a way of redeeming masculinity for the future because, he claimed, men were biologically and socially more suited to entrepreneurship than women. He talked down on what he called the tyranny of credentials, which essentially meant that more women were entering higher education and getting degrees as a way of entering into public life more thoroughly in the 1970s. He talked down on that and said we have to move away from credentials and towards the risk-taking of male or masculine entrepreneurship. So all of these ideas were tied in, his ideas about gender, his ideas about economics, and he said we have to decrease taxes on entrepreneurs because they are the most moral among us. They're the heroes of capitalism, and they are masculine. These ideas, as I suggested earlier, became incredibly popular. They were taken up by the Reagan administration. Reagan ended up incorporating a lot of Gilder's language about entrepreneurship into his own speeches, particularly after George Gilder's cousin became a speechwriter for Reagan. We can see here this event, Reagan is honoring George Gilder at an event, the White House Conference on Small Business, celebrating the age of the entrepreneur. At this event, he presented Gilder with a medal for his contributions to entrepreneurship. So this helped kind of spur this cult of entrepreneurship throughout the 80s that became really, really popular. And throughout this time, Gilder turned his attention to Silicon Valley as kind of the pinnacle of what entrepreneurship could be. And he was particularly taken with this group that had, were kind of locally famous within Silicon Valley, that were known as the Traitorous Eight. Just as a show of hands, I'm curious, has anyone heard of the Traitorous Eight? Okay, yeah, so several people in here. The Traitorous Eight were the group of people that had started working at Shockley Semiconductor and found that it was really stifling. Their manager had really bad management style. And so they left and they struck out on their own and they created Fairchild Semiconductor, which is now credited with kind of creating the modern microchip. And the microchip is the device that powers personal computers and enabled kind of the massive mainframes of IBM to shrink down to the size of personal computers. So this was a really big deal in Silicon Valley. The silicon in Silicon Valley refers to the silicon in microchips. Before Silicon Valley was like a software town, it was a microchip town. And so this was this really important kind of origin story for Silicon Valley, was this entrepreneurial, launching out, risk-taking, invention, discovery. And it also came with its own story of patrilineal foundations. So after Fairchild, a bunch of these men all struck out on their own and created new startups, including some of the ones we would recognize today, particularly Intel was founded from some of these men. So the one in the middle is perhaps the most well-known. It's Bob Noyce is his name. But you can literally see now a famous family tree of startups in Silicon Valley that seem to treat these startups as kind of, offspring of each other in this patrilineal fashion. And so for Gilder, this origin story was incredibly appealing. It helped reinforce this idea of entrepreneurship as opportunity and invention, but also entrepreneurship as masculinity. It tapped into these cultural associations that already existed around tech being the domain of men, as well as California having this kind of cowboy manifest destiny mythology and the gold rush mythology. All of these were mythologies that kind of prioritized, the gold rush in particular, men going away from their families and kind of striking it rich. So throughout the decade, Gilder cemented Silicon Valley as the place where the ideal form of entrepreneurship was happening. And he particularly turned to the promise of digital technology. And this is the microchip. He started to argue that the microchip itself was just as important as the entrepreneurs who made it, because he believed that it was the product of entrepreneurship, and that by opening up this world of information to anyone with personal computer access, that it also would help drive more entrepreneurship. So he was talking about, at the time, what was a future scenario in which people could log onto a personal computer and start their own venture from home. That was really exciting to him. And so he thought this was kind of the pinnacle of entrepreneurship. And just as importantly, he argued that the microchip, by opening up the possibilities of computing and software to people in their homes, it opened up this quasi-spiritual world of information, where he argued that people could leave behind the material concerns of the world. In the world of what he called the microcosm, the world of information opened up by the microchip, you didn't have to worry about the messiness of women's bodies. You didn't have to worry about the material reality of poverty. This was a masculine world of ideas, a frictionless world, as he would sometimes describe it. And if you think I'm overstating the religious dimensions here, he made it explicit himself. He talked about microchips as the cathedral of our era, connecting humans with God, acting as this transportation, this in-between kind of holy space. And much like the Catholic Church, this was a realm of men. As the 1990s came around and new computing technologies started to be networked, Gilder brought this same zeal to the idea of networked computers. So he went from calling his ideas the microcosm to the telecosm, because he figured this information space would become a telecommunication space as well. And he was excited about this because as computing devices got networked to each other, that infosphere that he was so excited about would spread. And it could also lead to new power structures, because distributed networks, while many people at the time were excited about distributed networks as this kind of equalizing force, he said no, that by toppling the bureaucracies of the government and welfare and traditional education, and just having decentralized networks, that the natural hierarchies of the universe could emerge. So this was his vision of entrepreneurship as kind of a power structure, right? That you would topple down all of the bureaucracies and let entrepreneurship kind of emerge from these decentralized networks. So he looked at these networks both as a technological function, but also as kind of a social structure and a way for power to be structured. And he actually, in his writings about networked tech, he embraced, or I should say he dubbed a law that came to be one of the most guiding laws in Silicon Valley. It's called Metcalfe's Law. And again, just out of curiosity, show of hands, has anyone heard of Metcalfe's Law? Okay, a few. So Metcalfe's Law was developed by this guy, Robert Metcalfe, in the 1980s when he was inventing Ethernet, one of the earliest kind of network computing systems. And it was the idea that the value of a network is the square of the number of nodes in that network, which meant that each additional node in a network helped increase the value of that network exponentially. So you can see this kind of very basic idea that, if you have the only telephone in the world, it's of no value, right? The minute that one other person gets a telephone, then it's more valuable, and 5 people, and so on and so on. When Metcalfe first dubbed this, he used it as kind of a shorthand, put it on a slideshow, was thinking about this generally. Gilder was the one that termed this into Metcalfe's Law. He named it a law and turned it into a guiding kind of missionary purpose for digital networked technology in the 90s. So it was this idea of we have to connect as many nodes as possible to this infosphere, which is this spiritual world. So by the 1990s, he had developed this set of ideas that, as I argue, synthesized free market capitalism, techno-enthusiasm, and social conservatism. And if on the one hand that had manifested in the earlier days of the 1970s as this pessimistic version of society, what he called the sexual suicide society, dominated by the welfare state, the pill, and feminism, then the optimistic version of this was kind of the other side of the coin. This was a world of the nuclear family, of entrepreneurship and male breadwinners, and networked digital information technologies. So this is the set of ideas that I've come to call reactionary futurism. But so far I've only told you about this one guy, George Gilder, and how he came to these sets of ideas. So how did these ideas actually get legitimized and popularized, particularly in Silicon Valley? So First, I want to mention that, in fact, it was these ideas in part that helped build the Silicon Valley mythos in the first part. So before, in a second, I'm going to talk about a Silicon Valley press that emerged. But before that existed, in 1982, Time magazine published its first ever cover story on a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. You can see here a young Steve Jobs striking it rich. And this article is entirely about the mythos of entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurs would be carrying us into the future. And the person they quoted to make that case was George Gilder. And this is a direct quote from Gilder in this article. Entrepreneurs are fighting America's only serious war against poverty. The potentialities of invention and enterprise are now greater than ever before in human history. Now, there's no explicit discussion of gender in this article, that falls by the wayside, but it's made implicit by the examples that they use and by the fact that this is part of Gilder's philosophy. So I just want to mention that even before these ideas traveled to Silicon Valley, they were helping craft this ideal of Silicon Valley. But if we turn to the late 80s and early 1990s, we can see a burgeoning tech press that did take Gilder's ideas to heart. And in particular, I've looked at this magazine called Upside Magazine that was founded in the late 1980s by two young conservatives living in Silicon Valley. And they were inspired by William F. Buckley and George Gilder to start a business-focused, personality-focused magazine focused on high tech. So this was before Wired magazine existed. This was kind of the first Silicon Valley personality-devoted glossy magazine. And in many issues, they promoted an explicitly Gilder-informed idea of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs as the heroes of society, as rugged individuals creating wealth, as technological inventors. But as you will see, they also openly challenged what they saw as an encroaching threat of feminism and political correctness, most famously or infamously in this cover story asking, has Silicon Valley gone pussy? This featured on the cover here is the man who was leading Apple at the time. Steve Jobs had left. You can see he's in this like foppish outfit and is a sandbox that's getting kicked over. Really kind of depicted as a sissy was the language they used. The article itself was called The Pussification of Silicon Valley. And they argued that entrepreneurs needed to fight back against this pussification by asserting the rugged masculinity that had once presumably prevailed in the Valley. They were careful to say that this didn't mean there shouldn't be any women or people of color in Silicon Valley, but they said that they should also assert this aggressive masculine style. So they kind of covered their tracks and they said the people that we're opposed to are not girls, they're men who throw like girls. So it's kind of this pushing back against what they saw as feminization. In addition to that, there was also a lot of strategic legitimization work that happened, particularly through Forbes magazine. So I think we think of Forbes as kind of one of the primary business magazines in the world. We can see on the right-hand side, that's Malcolm Forbes, who is the son of the founder of Forbes magazine, and he's kind of credited in the later half of the 20th century with building up the magazine and making its success. On the left-hand side is his son, Steve Forbes, who ended up running the magazine after his dad died. So in the 1990s, he took it over. And together, the two of them throughout the 80s and 90s ended up really targeting Silicon Valley as a space that they wanted their readership to focus on. And they amplified the ideas of reactionary futurism, and they helped build out reactionary futurist networks in the Valley. So to look at this more specifically, in the 1980s, Steve Forbes, that grandson, the younger Forbes, he ended up meeting George Gilder, and as accounts of the time have talked about, he was bedazzled by Gilder. And he worked to really give Gilder a bunch of different pulpits from which to broadcast his ideas. So in the late 1980s, Gilder wrote 2 cover stories for Forbes. But in 1992, Steve Forbes went even further and created an insert called Forbes ASAP that was automatically distributed once every couple of months to all of Forbes' 700,000 subscribers. And it was focused on high technology. And every single issue, or nearly every single issue, had a long-form essay by George Gilder about the state of technology and how, what he saw as needing to happen for this world to take place that he wanted to see. Forbes also in 1996 ended up co-publishing the Gilder Technology Report, which was the investment newsletter that I brought up at the beginning that ended up creating that Gilder effect. And we can see by the year 2000, the journalist Paulina Borsak, who wrote for Wired magazine, said that in some circles, Gilder had become considered high-tech's supreme intellect. So he was getting popularity and legitimization within Silicon Valley specifically. But beyond Gilder himself, Forbes also acted as a space for network building, what Fred Turner has called network forums, right? Spaces where people from different communities can come together and form a network and kind of trade ideas, gain legitimacy from each other, and synthesize certain ways of talking about the world. So Forbes already by the 80s had brought in many people from the business press and was one of the primary outlets of the business press. They celebrated personal wealth. In 1982, they established the Forbes 400, the richest people in America. They celebrated free market capitalism and decried regulation of business. But even beyond Gilder in the 1980s and 90s, they also brought in people from the world of tech publishing. They brought in Esther Dyson in particular, was a very influential writer of a tech newsletter at the time, who they brought in to write a regular column and a regular feature on computing technologies. And they also brought in regulars from the conservative press. Particularly throughout the 1990s, they hired a slew of cultural conservative columnists from the Hoover Institution down at Stanford and from National Review, William F. Buckley's conservative magazine. And so almost every issue of Forbes magazine that you would open up from the 90s had some sort of column decrying affirmative action, women in the workforce, or any number of conservative reactionary positions at the time. Steve Forbes and the Forbes Corporation also ended up working to build in-person networks in the 1990s through conferences. So here are 2 advertisements for upcoming conferences at the time. This one on the left was called Bandwidth Blowout, and this was co-hosted by George Gilder and Forbes magazine. And if you take a look at the speakers on this program, you can see a mix now of conservative figures, business press figures, and not only tech writers, but tech founders and entrepreneurs. So we can see let's see, the lower face here is Steve Forbes. You can also see a couple above, though, is Mark Andreessen, who at the time was not yet one of the most well-known venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, but he was one of the most well-known founders because he had just founded the first web browser, or the first commercialized web browser, Netscape. A couple above that, Larry Ellison, who had founded Oracle Corporation, and at the time was the richest man in California. George Gilder on the right, Metcalf of Metcalf's Law. Really, this ended up being what we can see as a mix of kind of a tech expo where people brought new technologies to demonstrate, a business conference, and a think tank event where ideologies and political ideas were discussed. And these ended up being opportunities to blend ideological and business projects, and a way of conferring expertise and building community. And I realized I skipped past this one. This was one that actually Forbes ASAP did together with the Cato Institute, which is a little bit more of a libertarian think tank. So you can see kind of the king of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman there. T.J. Rogers was, in the 90s, a really well-known semiconductor entrepreneur who kind of reveled in being anti-politically correct. And then you have Eric Schmidt, who at the time was with Sun Microsystems, but who would go on to be CEO of Google. Eric Schmidt, you can see, actually talked at this one too, but he wasn't yet famous enough to warrant a photograph. And just to give you a sense of the types of, the way that ideas were flowing and communities were being built, Eric Schmidt, when he went to this, one of his quotes from the meeting was, "George, you are always the first to get it right." He was observing George Gilder's ideas and embracing them and accepting them. And at the Cato Institute conference in 2000, a young speaker who had just co-founded PayPal, Peter Thiel, looked around the room and said it was like being at a really good rock concert because of all of the people there. We can start to see how these ideas were trickling down to a new generation of tech founders and spreading across the tech world and the world of right-wing think tanks. So just to wrap up, the impacts here, and here we can see this is a Forbes ASAP featuring Mark Andreessen, that by the end of the 1990s, there were very well-established reactionary futurist networks in Silicon Valley. These ideas were being spread, validated, expertise was being conferred upon people like Gilder and his colleagues. Sometimes the gender and conservative politics elements were made explicit, sometimes they were not. But even when they weren't, these communities helped form a broader spread of the Silicon Valley mythos and the common sense ideas that we found within Silicon Valley. Whether that was the idea that entrepreneurs were the heroes of the future who should take over and shape the world, whether it was the idea of Metcalfe's law and the network effects that new digital technologies should pursue growth and an expansionist approach at all costs. I'm not trying to say that conservatism in the Valley was anywhere near as visible as the Californian ideology was, but I am trying to say that an important and influential group of people did take on these ideas, and they also shaped how broader sets of people thought about tech and the world. And that helped set the stage for what we are observing as tech's right turn today. Thanks so much, and now I'll open it up for questions. Yeah.
Super interesting talk. I'm curious what extent you believe.
Oh, thank you. Oh, lovely.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My question is about what might have been the motivations behind the right-wing tech leaders to pursue that kind of ideology. Obviously, they might have believed it themselves, but is there like an alternative explanation? Maybe it fit their interests. What would have been like the motivations for them to pursue such an ideology?
That's a great question, and it seems to have varied between people. So someone like Larry Ellison was a Republican through and through. He kind of, flaunted his disregard for women throughout the 80s and 90s, I would say, that like misogyny was a core part of what he was doing all throughout. So I think that very naturally synthesized. But at the time, someone like Mark Andreessen was not overtly conservative in any way, and in fact did some projects with the Clinton administration. And so I think that there's a tendency to think of someone like him as being, inherently liberal and then switching. And there's certainly an element of that is true. But what we have is, Andreessen was the first person that was conferred as a netrepreneur, an entrepreneur of the net. He was indicative of this switch to a moment in time where digital technology, people could create a startup, write 8,000 lines of code, and then become a multimillionaire within a year because the IPOs happened so quickly now, right? And so when he was under the age of 25, he was already a multimillionaire. He had been on the cover of Time magazine, calling him a golden geek and saying that this was the future. And this fit very neatly in with what George Gilder was saying, which was that, we should not be listening to credentialed experts. We should not be listening to government figures. We should be listening to entrepreneurs, not only about technology, but about how wealth creation should happen in general, about how, more and more saying about how to live in the world. And, someone like Mark Andreessen also took on Metcalfe's Law as kind of a missionary project to, when he moved from Netscape to AOL and became the CTO of AOL and kind of used it as this way of like, we must drive growth of this industry at all costs. And by the 2000s, he wrote a pretty famous in Silicon Valley blog post called "Software is Eating the World," basically saying that all industries were now becoming software industries and that was a good thing. So it was this really expansionist project. So even though it wasn't kind of overtly drawing on the gender politics of Gilder, that was all implicit. And I think when you start to see this get challenged in the 2010s, then you have this real reactionary piece come out. And when someone like Andreessen's own power gets challenged, then you see him more explicitly leaning into the gender side that what I'm trying to show was kind of implicitly there all along, even for those that maybe didn't think about it. Yeah. Yeah.
Which, like, I think further bolsters this image of progressive technology makes the right turn.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, first of all, I do think it's important to, as much as I relied on it so much, the terminology of Silicon Valley can be misleading because it does suggest kind of one unified community and space when in fact there's many different, things that can be evoked by the term Silicon Valley. And I would say, yes, that the rank and file workers have a much broader spectrum of kind of where they're coming from, everywhere from kind of, liberal support of gay marriage to the people, No Tech for Apartheid and Tech Workers Coalition kind of challenging some of the fundamentals. I will say that you also have seen throughout some of the rank and file workers being explicitly reactionary. So people may remember in 2017, there was a case of a Google engineer named James Damore who published a memo internally basically suggesting that women were biologically less prone to have the skills that made one a good engineer. And so that caused a huge flurry. Google fired him. He did the rounds in conservative media. But there also were a lot of people that ended up voicing support for him from within the tech community. And so we know that there was at least some amount of presence throughout the 2010s as well through cases like that. So I think it is a real mix, and it certainly, as I said, I would never claim that it was the majority of rank and file workers that did this, but I do think it's important to note these networks, which in fact, in many ways mirror the way that right-wing elites build power, like in Washington, D.C., right? That, there's amazing sociological work by Thomas Medveds that looks at think tanks, how right-wing think tanks build power. And it's not by building public consensus, it's by kind of, reinforcing their own expertise and ideas and then kind of changing the underlying assumptions. He talks about how the welfare debate changed from one of need to one of dependency, and saying, oh, we can't make people dependent on welfare. And that was the work of right-wing think tanks. And then you had people like Bill Clinton embracing that way of talking about it by the 90s. And I think something similar happened in tech, where it was, even as people in the rank and file were presumably liberal, they started to incorporate some of these underlying ideas. The idea that entrepreneurship is the best way to tackle poverty, social entrepreneurship, nonprofit entrepreneurship, all of these things have become so widespread. And so I think that there's some of that like underlying assumption piece at work too.
Thank you so much, Becca. That was great. And actually, my question was about the think tanks, because the supply side movement was very much located in the think tanks. And when Reagan came to power, of course, all of these people came into his administration. And was one of the things that was very unusual is that a lot of people, traditional posts that would go to academics were now filled by people from the think tanks. And so I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about Geiler supply side, position within that movement, and also understanding how that might carry over today, because we are seeing essentially the same thing, right? We are in a period where the Heritage Foundation is the big organization inspiring the whole Trump agenda, with also a strange alliance with the tech moguls like Musk and Thiel and people like that. So
absolutely, yeah. I think that the broader building out of think tanks has been a major piece of how the right has built power in the second half of the 20th century and beyond. And some of it is also around challenging traditional forms of scholarship and expertise, saying we're going to take these policy discussions out of the hands of social scientists in universities and bring them into the world of think tanks, where we can have an ideological project and build research around that ideological project. And that's exactly right. So the welfare debate was a big project for think tanks in the 80s, supply side economics, and that was the world that Gilder came out of. So in the 70s, he was kind of publishing through National Review, but then he became kind of one of the first big stars of the right-wing think tank called the Manhattan Institute, and it was him in the first half of the 80s, and then the other big star in the second half of the 80s was Charles Murray, who ended up writing The Bell Curve, the kind of race pseudoscience book. And then Gilder ended up working with the Hudson Institute, another right-wing think tank. And then out of the Hudson Institute spawned a couple of other think tanks. So there was, one in Seattle called the Discovery Institute, which was at the time kind of a high-tech focused one, but since then has become much more about challenging evolution in schools. And there was one in Washington, D.C. that I am writing about in the book as well, that was called the Progress and Freedom Foundation, and they focused on the deregulation of tech. So you see this think tank project getting kind of taken as the ideas traveled. It was through this strategy of kind of think tank network building and legitimation that started in the world of the right and Washington, D.C., and kind of made its way to the world of Silicon Valley as well. And I think that is really important. Again, yes, seeing Project 2025 now coming out of the Heritage Foundation. And you also will see, if you start looking at some of these tech billionaires and tech elites, that a lot of them are funding some of these think tanks, and a lot of them have started their own think tanks. And we can see it in projects as well, like the University of Austin, which was kind of created as like an anti-woke university. And it's people like Joe Lonsdale, the co-founder of Palantir, have played a major role in that project. And so, yeah, think tanks continue to be a really big way for tech elites to try to build and legitimate their ideas, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Fascinating talk. Hearing all the history of how all these movements and trains of thought began, like it makes me think of that, like the current situation and what are the movements that are emerging in this space. And like two that come to mind are that I could see a connection, or that they can play a role in the future, are the effective altruism movement, and these people who are obsessed with having children. Then
The pronatalists.
yeah. So
Yeah.
like, do you see a connection there? Are you exploring that?
Yeah, great question. So this started as my dissertation project, and in the dissertation I had planned to kind of trace this through to the present, and then found there was so much to tackle in the 80s and 90s that I just kept it there. As I'm in the process of turning this into a book, I am looking towards the 2000s, although it remains to be seen just how close to the present the project will go. But so the short answer is I haven't traced the ties directly, but what I have found, as I've started to look at the next wave of this, it was very much what came to be known as the PayPal mafia, led by Peter Thiel and the early employees at PayPal, who very much were kind of growing into adulthood in this environment. They went to Stanford undergrad, they started a conservative student newspaper, they got some help from the guys who started Upside magazine. They were very much in this milieu. And so I'm starting to trace how that impacted the PayPal mafia. I don't know whether there's direct ties to the pronatalism movement, but it certainly resonates, I will say that much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Becca. I have a question about what does George Gilder's theology look like? Because there's a lot of, I'm hearing the talk for a second time, and there seems to be a lot of analogies and metaphors that are deeply Christian. And I'm not like, Peter Thiel admires people like Rene Girard. There seems to be a connection between Christian theology and technological progress as a historical project that I think a lot of tech conservatives today take very seriously. I wonder what does that look like for Gilder and his associates?
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting is that by the time you get to Thiel with Rene Girard and now J.D. Vance, it becomes kind of explicitly Catholicism. And Gilder was not a Catholic. He was a Protestant. But what's so interesting to me is that he taps into the imagery of Catholicism, right? He's specifically talking about cathedrals, and he talks about kind of monks and all of, he uses that imagery a lot. And I think that he was a very devout Christian, but he also was kind of, he saw God's hand in all of the technological progress that he saw around him. And so I think that he did start to play fast and loose with that imagery a little bit because, whatever kind of theological terminology he could find that seemed to resonate worked. And I do think it's interesting that we talk a lot about the religious influence in Silicon Valley, but to date, because of this centering of the Californian ideology, it's tended to focus on the influence of Eastern religion. So there's a great ethnography, Eat, Pray, Code, I believe it's called, and looking at kind of how Buddhist principles get kind of completely westernized within the Silicon Valley context. But people haven't really looked at this Christian element as much, and I think there is a real Christian spirituality that we can see at work throughout Silicon Valley. And in fact, if you read like one of the classic works of history of science, The Religion of Technology by David F. Noble, he talks about how technology for hundreds of years has tapped into this sense of human salvation. And I think there was a real fear in the 1970s from some of these conservatives and reactionaries that, American society was in moral decline and was in failure of kind of falling apart. And so tech played this redemptive role for them as well. And I think you still see that, strains of that too.
So I was going to ask you a little bit more about, you had these things with concentric circles. And part of this Californian ideology is something like libertarianism. And the hippie philosophy is at least partially libertarian. And I'm wondering the degree to which this economic libertarianism, which drives a lot of what your talk is about, is really the things that all these people agreed about. And the social conservatism part, I get it and I see it, and I see it, of course, in the stuff that's now.
Yeah.
But I don't see it as being so central or so in opposition to that Californian ideology. And I was just wondering if you would reflect on that for a second.
I agree completely that actually it's not so far from the Californian ideology. And in fact, even in their original article, Barbrook and Cameron identified, they said, there was an influence of the new right in Silicon Valley. They don't really talk about the cultural dimensions of that to the extent that they do. They fall into a trap that is very common when writing about the right, which is that they treat it as kind of a pathology. And in fact, I think that there's this enduring mythology, or just maybe mythology is too strong a word, but there's an enduring link in the way that discourses have been created around around technology and social progress, and this idea that technological progress somehow must be linked with social progress. And so I think that Barbrook and Cameron end up saying that even the new right ended up embracing the new technologies despite their backwards looking ideas. And in fact, what I'm trying to show in part is that it wasn't despite their conservative ideas that they embraced the new technologies, it was because of them. And I think that is an important distinction, even as you're saying, like the economic pieces got foregrounded very often, that nonetheless there was a way of understanding digital technologies as a savor of an older form of society. But yeah, the similarities were very, very real. And in fact, it meant that, when Wired magazine put Gilder on the cover, that could only happen because there were similarities, right? That a lot of the people that are thought of as primarily kind of left-leaning libertarians, like John Perry Barlow, he was a lifelong Republican and a cattle rancher in Wyoming who, wrote a lot of what could be described as misogynist things, So it's not like they were so worlds apart in their worldview, but I think that the guys I'm looking at did emerge specifically from this kind of William F. Buckley traditional conservatism world, whereas someone like John Perry Barlow came out of the hippie counterculture. So even though they converged on these different elements, they were coming from slightly different worlds around it.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I just want to ask another group of tech companies. So because we talked about Silicon Valley, but it was interesting. What do you think about the Seattle tech scene? Because I think they're also a tech. Are they different? Are they competing in some aspect? Are they turning right? And I mentioned this because in the last magazine that you showed, it was something about how to topple Bill Gates. So
Yes.
there seems to be some competition there, and at that time, Bill Gates probably the richest guy in the world or in the country. And I'm from the law school studying antitrust. So in the 90s and 2000s, it was when Bill Gates was getting Microsoft was getting all these antitrust suits and showing how bad or snobby the tech scene was. So I was just interested in your thoughts on this.
Yes, it's such a good question. So, by this point, Bill Gates was kind of, as you said, was facing criticism and potentially antitrust efforts from the government. But you also had people within Silicon Valley, including George Gilder, starting to really criticize Bill Gates. And they had a different reason for it. And they ended up basically forming this little network of people focused at Sun Microsystems and Oracle to kind of fight against Microsoft, particularly Sun Microsystems. But a lot of that was based around the fact that Bill Gates was partnering with NBC and what they saw as the liberal media to help create kind of an extension of the liberal media that they hated so much. And so, you can see Gilder writing at the time about visiting the Microsoft campus and meeting with Bill Gates, and he really disparagingly writes about the like Starbucks lattes. Everyone was carrying a latte, right? All of these cultural indicators in the 90s that meant you were liberal. And so in that case, it became kind of the David versus Goliath, David being Sun Microsystems, which again was led by the conservative Scott McNeely. And that's where Eric Schmidt was. So, you have him in the fold. And it was kind of this idea of like, we're having this small tech creative disruption against Bill Gates, who at once was disruptive, but now has become part of the establishment. That was kind of the way they depicted it. And again, you can see echoes of that in, the way that Mark Andreessen talks about things now. He like goes after Google and he says, well, Google has lost its way because it's gotten too big, but we speak for small tech. And so what we really need are policies that speak towards small tech, whether that's AI or crypto or whatever, yeah.
Hey, Becca, really enjoy your perspective. And as an individual that moved here in 1993 from the UK, and I'm
Wow.
not British, but living and working over there, it was purposeful. It was clear that the Silicon Valley economically was about to take off. And the research I was doing at the time, it was going to take off primarily due to all the topics you talked about. But there's a long thread in history of R&D and a tie to the military-industrial complex from post-World War II through to today, right? And so curious why you didn't touch on that influence in terms of lots of the issues that you discussed in terms of manliness and pacification, et cetera, because to me that seems like a very strong influence and why this was a fertile ground for Gilder and Buckley and others.
It's such a good point. And the main answer for this presentation is time. But I agree. I think that's such an important thread. And that another reason why, when we talk about Silicon Valley as libertarian, that really in many ways is a misnomer, because so many of these cases, Silicon Valley was always very happy to work with the government as long as it was contracting through the military. Fairchild Semiconductor, their first contract was to build, computer parts for missiles. Oracle, Larry Ellison, his first client was the CIA. All of this absolutely taps into it. And I think the ideology is really about deregulation and free market capitalism that enables kind of working together with a militarized government. And I agree, the masculinity piece is absolutely there. It didn't manifest as clearly, though, until the 1980s and 90s, when these guys came around and built the media infrastructure for that to start being perpetuated. So it's like the mythos really wasn't there beforehand. It had to be created. And it was in the 80s and 90s when that got created. But yeah, I mean, from that to Palantir today, I mean, direct line, absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
You just kind of touched on it, but in your talk, you present Gilder and these ideas and his clear influence on people who, through that time period, were building what would become some of America's most valued companies. The link I was kind of missing was drawing a connection between these ideas and what these people were actually building.
Yeah.
Like what they were building, what they were doing, and maybe even the companies that how they approached organizational structure, things like that. I mean, some of what you're talking about, Palantir and things like that, draw those connections pretty clearly. But
yeah, absolutely. So I think we start to see the beginning of this in the 90s with the formation of companies like Netscape, which, I mean, it really was an astoundingly new kind of company because, as I said, for years, Silicon Valley was a manufacturing center. They were manufacturing microchips. And it wasn't until the 80s and 90s that it became a software center. And the manufacturing of the microchips was, went overseas. And it truly became this kind of idea factory. And even with a software company like Microsoft, that Microsoft operating system required several million lines of code to operate. It really was a big deal to then have someone like Mark Andreessen walk in, create a startup where you only had to write 8,000 lines of code, and then kind of within a year you could become incredibly powerful. So I think you see some of these ideas translating into this structure of kind of rapid fire startup creation, helmed by kind of a charismatic founder figure who has control over the rest of the company, becomes a celebrity, kind of gains all of this cultural capital as well as economic capital, and has an expansionist mindset around network growth. So I think you see that, getting translated through Mark Andreessen, through Peter Thiel. All of them were kind of, Elon Musk too, all of them were like explicitly interested in being celebrities and kind of celebrated heroic mythical figures. And they all adopted this network growth approach to, you create a few thousand lines of code and then you rapidly scale it. And they were very, very impacted by the Metcalfe's law idea that like, you have to build out that network. What's that? The entire gig economy, absolutely. And so, what happened was Gilder himself, his credibility really went through the floor after the dot-com crash because he, was an optimist for days, said no crash was coming. So he kind of ended up falling out of the picture. But the people whose ideas got influenced by him and this broader network, particularly Andreessen and Thiel and Schmidt, they went on to kind of create the next wave of tech companies, right? And so, when in 2004 and 2005, you have Mark Zuckerberg starting, Facebook, the early funding came from Peter Thiel. The early board members were Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen. These were the people then influencing the next generation after that. And so even though, I think by the end of the 90s, you had this growing identification of this rising, techno-fascism or what different people called it. And the crash kind of stopped any observation of that because a lot of people lost their wealth. But the ideas kind of stayed latent and got built into the next wave of tech companies, is what I would argue.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I really like how you started by saying, by showing like the media clips by, hey, this isn't really a new thing. This actually has always been here. Do you think that the reason why it seems like it's so brand new is because, I'm trying to think of like maybe three reasons why. One, because Silicon Valley, California, it's a one-party, dominated state, obviously. So the heads of these companies had to kind of play ball, in order, to start. And then also maybe second is because I also want to tie this into like the masculine and feminine too, though, because I went to UC Berkeley here. I studied political economy. I've worked in tech my whole life, and I've noticed, that men and women do gravitate towards different fields. Like, for example, marketing is heavily dominated by women who primarily come, very highly educated straight out of academia and then into these companies. So maybe that's why a lot of the, the marketing for maybe it's like, Pride or for women's or, anything like that. It's, company facing. Yeah. So maybe that's why like, the voice that was given, but also now that you have, probably the reason why it seems new is because with Donald Trump, you have a businessman, very, very pro-masculine guy who's coming into politics, and now it's sort of, the first term was more like kind of like haphazard, like a real, but then with the second after COVID, it's like you have a lot of people online, especially with Elon Musk taking over X, and so you have. I'm just kind of thinking like how to tie this with now, like. Famous like before and after pictures of like when Musk took over X, Twitter. Like before you see like photos and it's like a lot more women, a lot more diverse, and then after you have it's like him mostly like with like a very, very smaller group of guys and kind of like promoting that as like, hey, like this is more efficient. We've cut out all of these DEI and like whatever, and now you're seeing that. You're also seeing guys like Mark Zuckerberg, going to UFC events, having Dana White on the board of Meta. So just like I just does that I don't know, does that make sense? Like how maybe this isn't really a new thing, but it's sort of evolving. And it's just becoming much more vocal, probably.
I agree that it has absolutely evolved, and I don't mean by, in any way to suggest that nothing has changed. I will say that, California is another case where I think it's inaccurate. Its reputation as being purely liberal is inaccurate because, in fact, the birthplace of much of the modern conservative movement was in California. That's where Reagan got his political start. That's where a lot of conservative activists around the Barry Goldwater movement in the 1960s started their organizing. That's where, tax revolts? Yeah, the movement, the movement against affirmative action, gained traction first in the 90s in California. English language speaking schools was passed in California. So all of these things, again, there's an enduring myth of California that doesn't always reflect reality. But in terms of the changes, I do think that there's been important changes that have happened. And one is that now these people, the entrepreneurs that were getting celebrated in the 90s have now genuinely become some of the most powerful people in the world. And in the 90s, you didn't have that yet. They were gaining, extreme levels of wealth really quickly, but the wealth that Mark Andreessen had in the 1990s is nothing compared to the wealth that he has now. And because there was such a friendly relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington for so long, and deregulation, that these people were really able to build out these tech empires, and, Elon Musk being the richest man in the world by, many several hundred billion. So I think that's part of it. And then I do think that this techlash that happened in the 2010s, after Trump got elected in 2016, you started to have more public pushback against tech companies for the first time. And this idea of, oh, maybe Facebook is not a source of democracy, maybe it's actually a source of disinformation. Maybe there's labor issues at work here, all of these things that started to bubble up. It was really the first time that any of these tech figures had faced significant public challenges. And, I think about Stuart Hall and his writing on common sense, and he talks about how it's really when common sense ideas get challenged that kind of the authoritarian impulse comes out. And so I think that you have this moment of, it's easy to not seem reactionary when everyone's celebrating you and you get to be the heroic entrepreneur. The minute that people start criticizing you, then you start to look for, who do I blame? And those answers are already sitting there. It's the same people that Gilder was criticizing in the 70s. It's the feminists. It's the, now it's a broader swath of people, so they call it, the woke mind virus or whatever. But I think that reactionary impulse has come back and now is being held by people with unprecedented power.
Well, thank you for fascinating discussion and presentation. 3 very short questions. One, do you think that there is much influence of Ayn Rand's ideas and her ethics, the attempt to heroicize the unheroic, so to speak, in the thinking and in the imagination of the movement that you're discussing? The second question, the age of industrialism generated its own mythology, right, and its own fascination with machinery and industrial production, right? And so you have the kind of technological mythology of treating machine as a metaphor for how to run and organize the society, right? The totalitarian machine, the totalitarian managerial state, and the fascination with that. So in your estimation, do you think that so what is the metaphor? What is the sort of reigning metaphor that comes out of the imagination of the reactionary futurists that you are discussing here in application to the big tech world? Yeah. And the third question, what exactly is heroic in the entrepreneurship, in the imagination of these people? Because ultimately, if you think of it, in traditional conservatism, right, especially in European conservatism, warrior is the paradigmatic source of heroic behavior, right? Yeah. Endurance, nobility, aristocratic attitude to life. So what is aristocratic? What is noble? What is heroic about the lifestyle of the of the people that you are discussing, or of the lifestyle that they are promoting?
These are all such great questions. To start with Ayn Rand, yes, she played a very important role. So I'm bringing back to this because T.J. Rogers in particular, who's such a fascinating figure, and was a real acolyte of Gilder's, but also was a real acolyte of Ayn Rand's, and he started buying copies of her books for his employees and would kind of teach her books in his companies. Gilder himself listed Ayn Rand as an important influence, although I do think it's interesting. She hated Gilder because he was Christian and she was so intensely atheist. And so there were important differences, but absolutely a lot of alignment as well. And I think particularly through this strain of, I start touching on it here, but once they started collaborating with the Cato Institute, Quinn Slobodian has been writing more about that strain of kind of how neoliberal thinkers ended up coming to race science and Silicon Valley, and you have kind of a convergence here of those groups. So I think you see even more among the neoliberal group kind of an embrace of some of Ayn Rand's ideas, but certainly present there. In terms of the ideal of masculinity, I do think there's still an element of the warrior there because I didn't get into it here, but I guess to an extent you see it with the pacification article, that there was this idea of, well, you want to be a visionary, but if someone attacks you, then you become an anti-PC warrior. So there was still the anti-PC warrior trope. But I think that the main thread of kind of heroicism that comes through is the heroic genius, which has also been a prevailing set of ideals, from the Middle Ages onward, and has created the mythos around people like Albert Einstein and everyone else, and has played into race science as well. But that also has been a distinctly masculine concept for as long as it's been around, and is a Christian concept as well, because originally it literally meant you were like touched by God and that you somehow interfaced between humans and God. So I think that that's kind of maybe the cultural figure that's getting tapped into as much as the warrior one.
Okay, so unfortunately we're out of time. So thank you so much, Becca.
Thank you all for the great
this great
questions.
talk.